Hello. This is the lecture on developmental tasks of aging. And the reason that I include this is that it is important that we as healthcare managers and administrators have some understanding of what elderly people need to be about in their old age in order to develop better care environments where older people can thrive. I think when I first started working in long-term care back in the 70s, we didn't have a very good understanding of this, and we created spaces and tried to entertain people when in fact what they really needed was some meaningful life experiences rather than simply being kept safe and entertained. The developmental tasks of aging were developed by a fellow by the name of Robert Peck. And he used the work of Jean Piaget, John Dewey, Lawrence Kohlberg, Erik Erikson, who were people working in the area of psychology that did some research looking at developmental tasks that people need to be about as they develop over their lifespan. But their work primarily was focused on younger people, mostly in children, because they wanted to help educators understand what was appropriate to teach at certain levels of development, so that, for instance, my 2-year-old grandson is needing to do some things, learning very well the word no, realizing that he is a separate person from his parents. And those are very different tasks than his 7-year-old sister, who is kind of working through her issues of being a 7-year-old. When those kids get to be teenagers, there's again another task that we have to further separate ourselves and become a separate person from our parents. And the extent to which we do that in a healthy way, we become healthier adults. Well, Robert Peck said, this stuff is interesting. I wonder how it would apply to old people of advanced age. And he studied folks 65 and older. So what kinds of things do 65 and older people need to be about in order to age well? And he came up with this list, which we call the tasks of aging. Being an elder, leaving a legacy, reminiscing and reconciling, moving from a sense of doing work related to simply being, who am I? Dealing with aches and pains that come with aging, and also mourning, because grieving or mourning is an important task. If you don't know how to do it well, you're not going to age well, because there's a lot of loss that takes place as we get older. The first task, being an elder, it's guiding the next generation, sharing with young persons the knowledge, experience, and wisdom obtained through living. How I took this idea and put it into practice in my work as a nursing home administrator, when I was in Fargo, North Dakota, I had a 136-bed skilled care facility there. And my son was a first grader in elementary school, and my wife and I went to the elementary school for parent-teacher conferences, and the teacher mentioned the fact that she wished that she had some volunteers that could help the students by just simply listening to them read. And kind of light bulb went on in my head, and I thought, well, I have a group of people who would love to listen to elementary school students read. And I talked to her about that, the teacher about that, and we arranged to have the kind of a day trip for them. And they came to the nursing home, and they read to a group of residents who volunteered to do that. So we kind of matched the kids up with one of the residents, and they had a great time. The kids really felt like, wow, they were important because they were reading to these old folks. But it helped the residents have a sense of this being an elder, guiding the next generation. It fulfilled that need because quite often one of the biggest obstacles to being an elder in this today society is that we don't bring young people and old people together very much. A lot of old people segregate themselves in communities where there are very few young people. And especially in a healthcare setting, when we have like a nursing home setting, very seldom do we bring kids into that setting. But I think it's important. We need to think about that as we work in the field of long-term care. Another very similarly related topic or task is leaving a legacy, passing on something of oneself for future generations. I think musicians have a kind of advantage here because they can take part of what was left to them, legacy of jazz, for instance, taking the jazz as they find it, and then taking that and creating their own sense of what jazz is all about, and creating their own music, and then leaving that legacy for the next generation to build on. And I have a fire hat there. My dad was a firefighter, and I don't think he would have thought about his life or his legacy. And yet, his work going into, burning buildings to save people and not just seeing as part of his job, was part of his legacy that he left his kids, my brother and my two sisters. My brother became a fireman as well. So we sometimes just simply need to help people discover their legacy. We had a resident in Sunset Manor in Jenison, where I worked, who wrote poetry, and she wrote kind of as the muse came to her, and she would write things down on the back of napkins, on the back of placemats, on scraps of paper, and she had a little notebook too that she would write things down on. But it was quite kind of a hodgepodge of these poems that she wrote, and some of them were actually pretty good. And she put them in a shoebox. And they weren't very easy to share with anybody because they were just a pile of papers in this shoebox. But her granddaughter took that shoebox, asked her grandma, "Hey, can I borrow that? Can I look through that and read that?" And her grandmother was thrilled that somebody was interested. And what she did was she put them all in the computer and then printed out page after page and made a little notebook for her, loose leaf notebook of her poetry. That was a real sense of legacy. She thought, wow, look at this. I've got this book that I can now share with people. And she left it in my office for a few days for me to read, and was very proud of that. It was a sense, too, that she had something here that was more substantial, that would be passed on in the family after she was gone. I think that if we can, within healthcare, create ways that people either just discover their legacy or be able to more easily pass it on, like this resident, we're doing our jobs better. Another task is reminiscing and reconciling, coming to terms with what one has or has not been, or what one has or has not done. Um, the two older fellows in this picture were came together at a reunion, kind of an interesting reunion. One of these fellows was in the Dutch resistance during World War II. The other fellow was a German soldier that was in the occupying forces in Holland, and they came together, shared their experience, and came to a point of reconciling and reminiscing over the war years. And that's a real important thing to do as we get older. I find myself talking about some of the life experiences that I've had. One of the things that I'm sure many of you have experienced is older folks who tell a story more than once. You may have heard a story a number of times from a person, and that's because not that person thinks you didn't listen the first time, but there's a real need that person has to tell the story. And I talk to staff in healthcare, especially new staff coming in during orientation. And I'll tell them that part of your job is to listen to people tell their stories. It's kind of a rewarding part of the job, even though, again, some of the stories you hear over and over and over again. But I tell them, it's not. You may learn something from the stories of older folks, but it's very important for them to tell those stories because they help that person come to some term of reconciliation as they either share a troubled time in their lives or a very joyous time that they're very proud of, and be able to share that with other people. Another task is switching from doing to being. And I think this is one of the most difficult tasks for a lot of people, differentiating self from work after retirement. We had a fellow come into our facility when I worked in a small intermediate care facility in western Kansas, who had worked in construction his whole life. He didn't have any siblings. His parents had died. He never married. His work was who he was. He traveled around the state of Kansas, building various buildings, working for different construction crews, and but then at age 65, while he was on the job, suffered a pretty massive stroke, and it left him unable to work any longer, and he came into the nursing home after some rehab in the hospital. He was so upset and so angry, and just didn't see any point in living any longer. He's a very difficult person to care for. He was very unhappy. He had a really hard time making this switch, seeing value in just being himself, apart from that work that he did. And he died that way. He died as a very bitter, angry person. And so it's important for us to be able to help folks make that switch. And I'm not sure exactly what we can do other than maybe just be aware of this and to maybe even put together a support group or those kinds of things, helping people to discover maybe new tasks or things that they can do within the limitations that have been created as they get older. Another important task of growing older is dealing with all the aches and pains that come with that, accepting some physical discomfort, but then participating in ways to minimize discomfort without being preoccupied. I think as healthcare providers, we tend to help people focus on their aches and pains. We walk in and ask them how they're doing, how they're feeling, where does it hurt. And I think that's important information to get. But again, when I do orientation for new staff, I often will ask them to please try to talk about some other things. Gather the information you need to care for that person well. But in the casual discussion and talk as you're caring for the person, see if you can kind of steer the conversation in some other direction other than simply always talking about and focusing on the aches and pains that come with aging and disability. And then the last task is mourning or grieving, expressing and working through losses so that new interests are possible and the sense of loss is not overwhelming. Think of all of the things that people lose as they age. Pets that die, relatives, spouses, even children sometimes. My sister died of cancer at the age of 50, and my mom, who's now 85, that was about 10 years ago, just had a very, very difficult time adjusting to that loss. There's a loss of home. There's a loss of privacy if that person is coming into the nursing facility. A lot of losses. And they can accumulate. And if you don't know how to grieve well, that can be pretty overwhelming. And depression is very common among folks, elderly people, and elderly people especially in healthcare institutions, that because of all of the losses that they've have experienced. Now, we can help people through their losses by understanding the stages of grief, and understanding the grief in general, helping people to work through their grief, listening to them, not being too quick to say, oh, but look at all the things you should be grateful for. Don't always focus on your loss, but to really help people through those losses as we provide the care for them. So these are some ideas that I think is important for us to think about as we create better environments of care for the folks that we're caring for. Just think through how examples of these various tasks that you see in the older folks around you. All right. So some of this material will be on the exam, so just be aware of that, as well as the material on the biological aspects of aging. And you won't find this in the text, so here's the information is only here in these lectures and the PowerPoints. All right. If you have any questions, feel free to give me a call. Thanks.